So Mark's one of my clients who comes in very worried about, what's going to happen to him in the future. He's worried about the moles on his back. He's worried about environmental contaminants. He spends a lot of time thinking about that and what he might have been exposed to in his life. He worries about the future. And that's vulnerability to harm schema that we often see in our practices. Welcome to 7 Minute Schemas. I'm Ruth Holt.
And I'm Rita Younan. We're both clinical psychologists and advanced schema therapists, supervisor trainers. And hopefully what we're wanting to do throughout this series is introduce you to the 18 maladaptive schemas and how they might manifest clinically.
So vulnerability to harm, I think it's a really relevant schema to be talking about with a global pandemic happening. There are people who are very aware and much more aware possibly of the threat that's out there. But people who with this schema really have probably struggled their whole life with a sense that bad things are going to happen to them in a number of different ways, I think, Rita.
Yeah, and I think at this point, with the pandemic, it's either validating their fears or kind of making them kind of more conscious of the fact that bad things are going to happen and kind of reinforcing this hypervigilance and this fear at the moment. But maybe it's important to kind of talk about how it might look clinically, the fact that some of our chronic axis 1 disorders sometimes have an underlying vulnerability to harm schema sitting there, whether it's health anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, you might find panic disorder. What was some of the other ones that you've noticed clinically?
Well, I think particularly generalized anxiety disorder can really get quite fused about lots of different, catastrophes. Some people worry about going crazy or about an external event like a pandemic, or even just, having a sense that there's something bad about to happen, just a sense of dread, really, kind of sitting with them all the time.
Yeah, and that's a really good point in terms of generalized anxiety, typically because with the vulnerability to harm schema, there are those kind of 3 elements. It could be I'm going to go crazy and, get admitted to a psychiatric hospital, or I'm going to develop some illness and die, or it might be that I'm just going to lose everything and become financially destitute. So, you do come across those patients that have fears across all of those elements of the vulnerability to harm schema.
And I guess one of the things that we really want to work on when we're exploring these schemas with clients is the origins, right? What was that childhood environment like that gave rise to this? Think about the client I was just mentioning. One of the things that happened for him was his mum was not able to be a stable presence in his life. She had her own mental health issues. She was a little bit of a kind of relaxed parent, I think, in lots of ways. And so he, being the oldest, was often really concerned for his siblings' safety and health, and really felt like he was the grown-up in the house.
Yeah, so for Mark, or this particular client, Mark, it sounds like the acquisition of that schema was what, Jeff talks about, those 4 ways in which schemas can be acquired. So a toxic frustration of needs, so not having safety, predictability, consistency from a strong parent, whereas for some people it might be more of a selective internalization. So they might have an over anxious parent, so they've identified with that particular parent's kind of fear about things going badly. So it's kind of really important that, someone can have the vulnerability to harm schema and thinking about the ways in which it's been acquired, because that will impact how we treat that particular schema.
Exactly. And so when you're thinking about, not just using the cognitive and the behavioral interventions that we are probably all familiar with, but really digging into those experiential interventions where we want to go back in imagery, we want to give a corrective emotional experience. So for someone like Mark, actually going back into some of those moments in his childhood where he had to be the grown-up and really walking in and saying, that's not okay, that's too big for a little person, and confronting that parent, dealing with those attachment injuries that are underneath some of those fears that he has. So I think, that's really important to get the tone, the kind of quality of the environment.
And I think what's common too with a vulnerability to harm schema is the over-controller coping mode. And you'll have that in health anxiety, you'll have that in panic disorder, you'll have that in OCD, you also have it in eating disorders. So it's a really common way of coping with vulnerability to harm, the need for control.
Yeah. And, I mean, we're experiencing it right now, right? We've got a little baby who's very happily sitting beside you, I'm sure. But, we don't have control in life. And part of the cognitive work is really working through what is it to be in control? What is it to be safe? I think often these clients feel like I'm safe if I am in control, or I'm safe if there's no threat. And so really kind of drilling down on how they feel safe, not just how they think about safety, but even in their body. Often these clients are really hyper aroused and they need to use a lot of those kind of more body-based interventions, breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, yoga, all sorts of things to kind of down regulate that distress.
Yeah. And look, what I think is really exciting when we run our Chronic Axis 1 workshop online in a couple of months, we have the fortune of Susan Simpson agreeing to talk to us about the over-controller coping mode and how to actually work with that, So I'm really looking forward to hearing her thoughts on this coping mode and how it manifests itself with chronic axis 1 disorders.
Yeah. So I guess, from your perspective, what do you reckon are some of the pitfalls, some of the things that maybe therapists miss or get stuck on when it comes to vulnerability to harm?
Look, it could be some of the reassurance seeking. It's really, limited reparenting is about being that kind of supportive, available, reassuring parent. But I think when it comes to vulnerability to harm, less reassurance and more independence. The reassurance could be more about, I believe in you, you can do this. The probability of that happening is unlikely. And so I'm really going to get you to sit with your anxiety and start to kind of do some of the things that you're avoiding. So just kind of being mindful of not being, of how the limited reparenting works with that type of schema presentation.
Cool. That's our 7 minutes, Rita.
Wow, we could keep talking.
And so I want to encourage you guys, to keep working on your schema therapy skills. We'll be back again to talk about another schema at some point. But if you want to find out more information, you can visit the links at the bottom of this or go to Schema Therapy Institute of Australia.